I'm going to start this off with a brief recap of my part 1 review of The Last Kingdom. Firstly, I'd like to reiterate my opinion that this is in fact a brilliant show, and the main timeline events are surprisingly accurate, as we'll see in this video. The characters also have a sort of authenticity about them as well, and I will explain how this is later on in the video, referencing characters such as King Alfred and Earl Guthrum. In the first video, we have mainly looked at costumes and other visual aspects of the show. Visually, the show is not historically accurate in the slightest. And this, I believe, is a real shame. I don't think it would have cost anything extra to make the show visually historically accurate. In fact, it may have even been cheaper, since you don't need to create so many ridiculous fur rags for the Danes. One argument that could be made is that these visual elements were chosen for the sake of simplicity and having a distinction between Saxon and Dane. But I'd argue that there are many superior and more accurate ways to create these visual distinctions if only the producers and costume designers, for once, assume their audience has an ounce of intelligence. Instead of giving Saxons these ridiculous square shields, for example, they could have simply had the Saxon shields decorated with crosses and the Dane shields with pagan symbols. Instead of ridiculous fur rags on the Danes to identify them, you could have instead just had them wear their traditional Viking eyeliner and tattoos to differentiate them from the Saxons. The Saxons could be wearing Christian crosses as well to further distinguish them. But instead of this nuance and relying on the audience's intelligence and observational skills, we have hilariously bad fur rags and studded leather armor to contend with. And it's a real shame, since it takes you out of the immersion that the show creates with its authentic dialogue and its amazing storytelling. I feel like the show could have really been elevated from an 8 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10 with these simple visual changes. And now to finally move on to the positives of the show, the historical accuracy of the main events surrounding King Alfred. The main thing that makes this show so rewatchable and fantastic is mainly the characters and the actors themselves. King Alfred is one of the best examples of this. David Dawson does an amazing job of portraying one of the most famous and successful Anglo kings in history. Physically, Dawson does not quite resemble what the Saxon king is thought to have looked like. And the costume department once again drops the ball and makes Alfred look like some random unimportant noble instead of being dressed as a Saxon king should. But these minor flaws are easily overshadowed by the imposing character of Alfred the Great, which is a genuine representation of what we know of this historical figure. He really does feel like an authentic person, with strengths and weaknesses you would expect someone like Alfred the Great to have. There is very little overdramatization or exaggeration here. The highlights of Alfred's life are accurately portrayed, as you'll see later on, and you really get a good sense of the kind of man he may have been. Throughout the show, his idea of a united England is constantly thrown about, which is something the real Alfred also worked towards and laid the groundwork for. In fact, here's a short summary of Alfred's life just to compare and contrast with the show, and to see that they have in fact done a good job with the main historical events. King Alfred was one of 5 sons of the king Ethelwulf. His brothers had reigned before him, each putting up a fight against the Viking raiders sailing up rivers to raid and plunder. The concept of Wessex being the last kingdom is very accurate, as the Dane invaders had taken over Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia by 870 AD. Alfred's brother, King Ethelred, died at the Battle of Ashdown in 871, with King Alfred then becoming King of Wessex at the age of 21. In reality, King Alfred was a battle-hardened veteran, and not quite as weak and frail as he was portrayed in the show, despite him being afflicted with the same Crohn's disease that the show Alfred seems to suffer from. King Guthrum seized Chippenham, and Alfred retreated into the Somerset marshes. So far, we are almost 1-to-1 with the show. And whilst the show did briefly show something similar, legend has it that King Alfred burned loaves of bread, or perhaps cakes, that he was told to watch over by an old woman. The old woman then scolded the king. The authenticity of the story is certainly debatable, and it does date back to the 12th century, which is a few centuries after the alleged events. Either way, the show is doing a pretty good job so far. Alfred then built a fortified base in the marshes and summoned men from Wiltshire, Hampshire and Somerset. In 878 AD, Alfred defeated the Dane army at the Battle of Edington and caused them to retreat back into their fortress in Chippenham, where they were starved into submission. All of this has been reported by Alfred's biographer, Bishop Asser. So we can see that the real King Alfred was more of a warrior than he was portrayed in the show. The show uses the character of Uhtred to represent Alfred's warrior half. This is a fictional character, although there was a famous Uhtred the Bold that lived a few centuries later. Who's to say Alfred didn't have some converted Dane advisors, however? After the defeat at Edington, King Guthrum really did convert to Christianity and was renamed Ethelstan. Many of the Danes settled as farmers in East Anglia afterwards, and a border was drawn across Roman Watling Street and northeastern England, which became known as Danelaw. I'd also like to quickly mention how much I like the character of Guthrum in the show, as you can really see his internal struggle as he slowly gets drawn over to Christianity and begins to doubt his own gods, the more he is exposed to the god of Rome. It's a fascinating character arc, and you can really imagine the real Guthrum being in a similar situation and having similar thoughts. Alfred then also married his daughter Ethelfled to Ethelred, and also married Aelswith in order to secure a bond with the Kingdom of Mercia. His army was split into a rotation of the Fens and the Fjord in order to have a rapid reaction force ready at all times. He also built many new fortified trading posts or fortresses and a navy. A truly accomplished man with almost too many achievements to fully go in depth into. He wasn't just a warrior king, however, because just like his portrayal in the show, he was an educated king that loved learning. He had learnt Latin in his 30s and was involved in trying to make the Saxons more literate by translating Latin texts into Anglo-Saxon. He didn't just care about the Bible, as he had a collection of several books he thought the young man of Saxon Britain ought to read. In his own words, he had wanted the youth of England to be devoted to learning. These books ranged from history to geography and philosophy. King Alfred died just before the turn of the new century in 899 AD at the age of 50. He had laid the groundworks for a united England and had shaped the course of history in a massive way. So we can see that the show has gotten the main events fairly accurate, at least for the first 2 or 3 seasons. After that, we go into the realm of different kings and different rulers